And so sit up straight and tall and start to think about how asana functions. Like, where is the midline? Like, how do you access it? Like, so one, we're starting to use the body a little bit. So I'm moving around a little bit. Why? So I can feel other things, right? So I can get kind of a context of experience, right? And the idea of, so to realize the relief of Shavasana is an incredibly important part of the midline, right? Of finding the midline or realizing its strength. And so, but when I, like right now, especially in the afternoon, start to soften my organs of perception, I get sleepy right away, right? I can feel it. I didn't sleep well last night. So it's like, whoa, so I got to let this be true. So as I start to soften my, the edges of my mind, trying to find the words and all these things, I'm actually allowing, which is, I hope those of you that are in my class, at least, and getting from Mind Body Solutions, is that the energy you get from allowing is incredibly powerful. And remember, there's been another segment about the difference between acceptance and allowing, right? And I think for me, there's a big healing story difference between the two, right? I'm going to allow my mind not to be my toddler, not to be in charge. I'm going to make sure I stay sensitive while I'm speaking. So if I were you, this is what I would do. I'd keep my lips together and my teeth slightly apart. And I'd make sure there's really good contact, light, sweet contact between my lips, my tongue softening. So a sweetness starts to come that was always here, by the way. Right? And I let it drop. And then how does this energy be more than a drop? So that's when the body starts to come more into focus for me. It's like I have to let in how expansive my experience is, and then I still need to ground it. Right? So the instructions when you're sitting in a chair, feel your sitting bones, right? Feel your feet, is actually for, remember, you're taking care of your toddler now. Your mind is found, your brain is still receiving all the input from your body. Your mind is like narrowed it way down and made itself fragile, right? But the feeling your sitting bones and the inner heels of each foot is trying to give reference to the unknowable, which is the space between the sitting bones, down the inside of the legs. There's a whole bunch of our experience that's only here if you receive it. Right? But in order to receive it, that's why I say a couple of weeks ago, I had a whole class on prana rewards structure. Prana also rewards repetition. Right? And a lot of you already said that you need, it's coming from your practice. It's not an overnight realization. Right? So I'm just trying to find in this place that kind of falls behind my eyes that it needs to get active in order to not just be heavy. Because the lightness will get heavy unless it gets active. Right? You can't have it be light all the time. Right? And then release. So the other thing, obviously your spine's a midline, and I obviously think the midline is incredibly important, right? But I also want you to think about other midlines, right? So what is the midline of your arm? Right? Like if I had to say, hey, find the midline of your arm. So what's kind of cool is almost everywhere your mind will perceive there's a midline, there's usually a bone. There's already structure at the midline. Right? There's already something at the core of what's happening. Right? And so the fact that a lot of your midline energy is going to be contained in the bone. Right? And so, and the bone is part of why Iyengar yoga is so about alignment is it's trying to figure out how to find the circumference that allows the middle part. I don't just mean physical, and then release. So another way to find midline, right? We do this a lot in class. Try to do it to yourself if you can, right? Like I'm gonna calm my wrist. I'm having a really sore wrist in general, and one of the things that really helps is when I allow and hold my own wrist, and I give it boundary. So do it. Give your own wrist boundary. So then, and maybe it helps your mind to physicalize it. So I'm letting it like feel calmer. And I'm gonna move a couple of my fingers, but by you, and maybe I'll grab my arm a couple different places so I keep being able to locate what I can't quite touch. And I'm gonna move a couple of my fingers, but try to move it from the calming of my wrist. Because midline doesn't mean physical midline only. It means the inside of the outside. Right? So I'm actually going to try to generate my movements, not by my mind whipping my muscles, but by squeezing my awareness slightly towards the bone, feeling what that does, and then trying to move and expand from that sensation. So I know this seems stupid, but remember, I think it's not just that you're not just a drop in the ocean, but an entire ocean in the drop, but actually every movement is. So now I got to switch because I'm a good yogi, right? If I only practice it on one side, I'm going to miss it and I'm only going to go in circles the whole time. So I'm going to try to do it on my other wrist, which this wrist that hurts has a harder time comforting this wrist. That's always interesting, right? Right? Can you get your most sore spot to be a giver? Right? So I have to hold this down here, else I'm off balance. And so I'm letting the calming compression, at least in my experience of my body, the midline isn't anatomical. It's a quality of ineffable energy that's in my limb. Right? What I mean by midline, that's just for your mind, right? There's a directed inside of everything. So I'm calming my wrists and I'm moving my fingers or my palm even before my fingers, watching the muscles, feeling the muscles flex on my forearm. And when I get my hand too wide, I no longer can feel the midline. I can only feel the muscles. That's instructive. Try it again. Right? I'm going to go to the first side. Like, what if there was something to realize here? Like, how could like your life force come through the midline more? The midline in air quotes. Into action, recognizing that when I try too hard, my forearm grips too hard. And I no longer have the midline. I'm on the outside. Just making sense to anybody, the difference between there's a point where the action gets too strong, the muscles start to fire, and it's hard. Like when I'm in full flex on my hand, my forearm hardens, I don't have the midline, but this is how I have to navigate a lot of my life, is with the full flexed midline, with the full flexed arm. I want to see if what I'm saying makes sense to you. Someone weigh in, or thumbs up or thumbs down. And if it's thumbs down, explain what's not happening. Because the quality of awareness is what we're talking about in the midline. And I think that you should take comfort that your bones are in the midline. Right? That their stability is already there. Right? Again, toddler, resilient, right? I mean, it's like the stability is already there. All right, so sit up straight and tall again. So if you were to only be allowed to exhale, right? You'd keep finding that kerplunk place. Now let yourself inhale back up. And then exhale. Now make sure you're more aware of the two sides, your two lungs taking in air after the exhale, after the kerplunk. And then try to pay more attention to each lung, each nostril. Now don't be deceived. It's not just about what you feel in each lung and each nostril. It's the space between that's the midline. Right? And I mean space, not just physical, right? So one of the ways that is so powerful in asana is by constantly asking you to practice symmetry, they're revealing the midline over and over again. That's why you feel both sitting bones. You feel both inner heels in Tadasana when you're sitting in a chair. You feel the lung into both lungs, right? Because it's not the sitting bones that matter so much as the space, the experiential, ineffable space between the sitting bones. Now, when I find that space, so I'm moving a little bit, so I can find the space between my sitting bones now. And now, as I find it more and I ground the sitting bones, so the space between that I can't quite squeeze actually can now get reflected by lifting my chest. Right? So I'm literally trying to let the calm part of my consciousness, my shavasana, get direction by finding the structure at the midline, right? My sitting bones, connecting it down to my inner heels, feeling the physical so I can allow the midline through my spine, which it turns out you got a spinal cord there too, right? And there's a congruence between lifting my chest and taking an inhale. Can you take the air into each lung equally, knowing the midline between the lungs? So I'm wondering, when some of you take the inhalation, can you feel there's a downward direction? The inhale is coming up and expanding, and there's a downward direction down through the inner thighs to the inner heels, even when there's an expansion upward. What would it be to use this core sensation that we're trying to highlight when you're trying to be truthful? It's in your yoga practice that you have the opportunity to be the most truthful. My mind's going to try to externalize truth all the time, right? Midline's going to be required for my mind to be as honest as it can be and as accepting as it can be. It's not just about expansion. When I'm outside my midline, I'm probably, for me at least, trying to please others or defend myself, right? I'm in relation outside of my midline. I'm inevitably here when I'm in my midline. And I really have, over the years, last couple of years, been trying to tell you that your midline is for you, right? It's not for pleasing other people, right? It's for you. In your quiet moments, it's for you, which is part of, in Yeah. So now how does reference feed into this? So this calming energy that comes from Shavasana, or comes from boundary, starts coming into action, right? And I want everyone, all of you, like, I want your spine to actually be more dynamic. Doesn't mean I necessarily want you to do more back bends. Of course, that wouldn't hurt, right? But I want it to get used to moving. So the way I've been teaching this in my class has been, let a movement move all of you, right? Like, so I'm moving my spine, and I know even when I'm talking, how to make my mind be subservient to the movement of my spine, or be subsumed by the movement of my spine. Don't ever think you're just moving your spine, right? You're shifting out of mental energy towards dynamic force when you downshift to your spine, right? So, but then how does my midline help movement? So for me, one of my secret ways that I try to use my midline and find my midline is, for me, because my legs go out, and this might not be exactly true for you, but there's a core rolling in. So grab underneath your thighs if you can. You can't just try to see it and do it, right? Like rolling. So a lot of times in class, you might pull out the flesh, the muscle from under your leg, but this idea of rolling in, the head of the femur bone in, right? And then don't. And then roll it in again. Please, God, tell me you can feel a difference, right? And then don't. So, for lack of better words, when I don't roll in my thighs, I tend to leak more energy out my sides, right? So think about Tadasanas in every pose. Getting back to it, Jane's seen in Tadasana, part of the core of this is that something rolls in and goes down towards the earth at the inner head of the femur bone. Okay, that this action of in, whether you're standing or sitting, and by the way, I think it's easier to access when you're sitting, but this energy of inward and down is an essential part of your midline. So I'm just going to hold myself here and breathe. Not going to try to lift my chest yet. And if I forget what I'm getting when I'm rolling my own thighs in, all I have to do is not do it and see how much different the world feels to me, right? So repose, in other words. So start to get this rolling in, and this is why it's in so many instructions for full poses, full physical poses, right? Is that the rolling in creates a certain kind of energy, right? So I do this a lot to myself, right? And then my place holding for it is often when I'm like in a group of people, I need energy, right? I actually just put my hands underneath my back of my knees and roll and do that without it being so direct up here. I just do it a little bit and I ground and I feel my whole midline, where my nose is, where my eyes, the space between my eyes, the center of my chest, between my lungs. I lean forward to make it be slightly more aggressive, right? Where I'm in control a little bit. And I breathe in and out of my midline. So I'm taking a few breaths. Right? You know, so even when I do this, because I've practiced this enough, I don't have to do much to trigger the sensation. The physical movement in was only one doorway to the sensation. But I want the sensation. I want to know. And then as you feel your own midline, maybe there's something you don't do very well, right, in your life. Like, so just take a moment somewhere out in, trying to think of what, there are many things I don't do well. Okay, here's one that's coming to my mind that I often don't speak, especially in relation to my family, what I'm really like thinking and processing. And I always like make space for other people to do their processing, right? And so this is a strength and a weakness, but I'm gonna like let it be with me while I'm grounding in my midline. So find a thing in your life. Oh, I wish you did, the places where you lose energy in your life, right? Where you give too much, or maybe the people that are worried about crying, maybe in the resistance of crying, you're losing your midline, right? Or when you lapse into fear, you're losing your midline. So whatever it is in your story, right? Make sure you allow that it's gotten you here, and you shouldn't change it all the way, but have your midline there in that skill. Just don't accept it. Be dynamic, right at the intersection of your strength that is a weakness, and that your weakness that can be a strength. Find where you have experience. Good, and then release. So obviously, well, not obvious, but if you've been in my classes, I try to teach this all the time, that there's a real practical thing to the midline. What I'm finding lately for me is that when I practice my midline, I can be more accepting and truthful and dynamic about my strengths and weaknesses. Remember, I'm always going to try to take yogic realization and work it into the world. Because at a very deep level, what I'm learning in yoga strikes me as wisdom, right? And I don't know exactly how it applies, but I'm thinking something really wise is being passed on in my yoga practice, right? So obviously I've taught a lot. So take one arm off the side. I'm only taking one arm so I can stay balanced, right? And I've taught this many times. It's happened in so many poses, right? In order to go beyond my fingertips, I need to pull my shoulder blade back towards the midline in order to go beyond my fingertips. I also have to roll my shoulder blade in and down. So if this is hard, bend your arm. You can do the same thing with your arm down at your side, right? Recognize the role that the midline plays in expansion. Then you're gonna go the other side, right? And so we're just trying to no, in order to go, we're on one level of midline now. So I'm going up beyond my fingertips, but I'm taking my shoulder blade back towards my spine. So that's one level of midline, right? And then release. So now I'm going to try to add this midline through my arm back to the midline here with the midline that goes down to my sitting bones. Right? So I'm not just, and probably a lot of you already did ground your sitting bones because you already know how this goes. Right? So, so like I'm trying to stretch around my fingertips, roll my shoulder blade in and down, drop the inner head of the femur bone, extend down my legs down to the inner heel. Now I can tell I'm losing some of my energy because I'm straining my neck. Right? So I'm trying to, and then release. So finding the midline is often removing impediments to your sensation of the midline, not doing something else or something more. Now, going to go the other way, right? And again, so now I'm trying to use my shoulder blade, but then I'm going to try to go to my sitting bones, roll the femur bone in and down, stretch out to the inner heel, and then watch. Am I having my full midline? from where am I surveying my body? Is it from the front of your eyes or the back of your eyes? Are the back of your eyes more connected to your tailbone? Indeed, they are. Good, and then release. So now, like this idea of there being multiple midlines, both horizontal and physical, big realization, right? So I'm going to swing because I'm going back and forth again as a way to bring some rhythm into my midline, the core midline through the center of my body. Remember, the bandhas are thought to travel through here, right? So I don't want them to get static. I want them to stay alive, right? So I'm going back and forth through the midline again. What's kind of crazy about things like taking your legs wide and stuff is then you have this practice where the midline, the physical midline, right, is actually doesn't have anything underneath it, right? So my legs are wide, so it's like standing poses, right? Most standing poses besides Tadasana, and a couple of them have the legs wide. How do you realize your midline? Where are the midlines when you're expanded in the room? Of course, there's the midlines of your physical body, right? And that helps as one of the first layers. So, but where's the midline? The continuation of my spine. So there's a midline here. There's a midline here. There's a midline through my arms, right? Can I coordinate them all? What do I have to do? So here I'm going to grab my knees. Hope you're grabbing your knees. In other words, I'm going to give reference and structure so my arms and legs can come into sync and my spine gets to feed them equally. If I do the same thing with my arms slack, I don't have my spine feeding my arms and legs at the same level, right? So I'm creating reference, lifting my chest because I know I open to the more of the world when my chest is open. I engage my arms toward the bone. I stretch out, spread across my sacrum, go all through each knee. As I lift my chest, I feel the undersides of my arms, not just my physical arms. I broaden across the collarbones, between the shoulder blades. I am a whole series and layers of midline. And it's a good time to breathe. Good, and then release. Bring your legs back together. So here's an unfortunate thing maybe I'll teach about this on Monday, but so on your arm, you feel the midline like through the center, but what's the midpoint? Right? So another midline is going to be the middle third. Where's the middle third of your arm? Where do you have to go to find it? Right? Like, how do you get through the middle third? Can you push your will through the middle third? Try pushing your will through the middle of your elbow. How do you do that? If I'm talking location of the middle third, right? Bring the shoulder blade in and go beyond the fingertips. Now include from Shavasana the middle third of your elbow pit. Where does the middle third come from? It does not come from your will. Try it the other way. It comes from everywhere else. So I'm just like going through all the things of the class so far to find the middle third. If my whole arm from my wrist all the way down to my shoulder, all the way down, the middle third of that whole wall that, right, would be this part of my arm, right? That would be the midline. So your midlines just aren't traveling through your limbs. They're the middle third of your limbs too. So think about trying to figure out how to get the prana of your spine moving. So take your arms down by your sides. So we think about, this is the repeating instruction on so many asanas. Hit your tricep into the bone, your bicep back towards the bone. In other words, drop your inner edge of your shoulder blades, right? And then extend down and open your palms through your fingers. If I want to like not have my subtle body involved, I'm going to overgrip my elbow. I'm going to pretend I control the middle third. You don't control the middle third. You don't control the midline. You receive it. And then release. So you're sitting back in your life and you're kind of overwhelmed by how hard it's been, for example. Right? And what I heard on the call was that beautiful articulations of knowing and trusting your practice and knowing certain things. And there is no secret sauce, by the way. That's part of the secret sauce, right? Unfortunately, I hate that, but it's true, right? And it's like, well, what if you took seriously the ways that you've explored finding your midline in yoga poses and did it more often in a wider range of contexts? So I'm just actually trying to feel that right now. Good, and then release. So I should let the people go that need to go. I'm gonna stay on and talk because I try to pretend I follow time rules and stuff. So you get to go up and nothing smart will be said after this, but I do want to hear more what you're thinking and reply. But so don't you love that you typically don't practice many hands in prayers away from your midline, right? Think about, there's such amazing congruence to what you've been learning in asana. There's symmetry, there's connection, there's activation. And too many yoga students don't realize that there shouldn't be any fight. It's subtler than that. It's nonviolent. Your midline is nonviolent. It's just there, waiting, right, for activation.